When you think about it, so much relies on volunteers, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Especially for leadership roles, maybe when budgets are tight.
Absolutely. It's a common situation.
And it really makes you wonder, how do you actually help those volunteers, the really crucial ones, grow into leaders? What's the best way?
That's the million-dollar question for a lot of groups. You
Yeah.
see folks step up with passion, which is great, but leadership takes more. Development is really key.
Exactly. And that's what we're digging into today. There's this really interesting 7-step approach specifically for developing volunteer leaders.
And it's not just pulled out of thin air, right?
No, not at all. It's grounded in how adults actually learn,
Yeah.
Andragogy.
Right.
We found it in the International Journal of Volunteer Administration.
Ah, okay. Solid source.
And the core idea really seems to be this. You can't just assume you know what volunteers need. You've got to ask them. Get key people involved right from the get-go.
That sounds fundamental. Assessment, but mutual assessment.
Precisely. And what's great for you listening is, this isn't just theory. The article breaks down how it actually played out in a real organization.
Oh, interesting. Which one?
A grassroots nonprofit called the Farm Bureau. They use this exact 7-step approach.
Okay, so a real-world test case. That makes it much more concrete.
Definitely. So if you're involved with volunteers, maybe you manage them, maybe you are one, or you're just interested in leadership, this deep dive should give you a pretty clear, practical roadmap.
Like a shortcut to figuring out how to engage and empower adults when they step into these leadership roles.
Exactly. Okay, so let's frame the problem first. What are the main challenges when you try to develop volunteer leaders?
Well, the W.K. Kellogg Foundation put it nicely. They said it's both an art and a science. It's complex.
Art and science, I like that.
Yeah. It's not just about teaching skills. It's about fostering real growth. Kellogg talked about a triple focus.
Triple focus. What does that mean?
It means focusing on 1, the personal change in the volunteer themselves, 2, the change within the organization they're part of, and 3, the impact on the wider issue or community.
Ah, so individual, organizational, and community levels. They're all connected.
Right. And that community impact is often why they volunteered in the first place,
That makes sense. And the article mentions something critical, connecting the learning to what they actually need and feel.
Yes. If volunteers don't see the relevance, or if they feel like it's just being done to them, they might just check out, disengage.
You lose that buy-in.
Totally. Someone named Bradner pointed this out way back in '99. Engagement is everything. And the article contrasts, like task-focused volunteers with those who are genuinely transformed by learning.
Transformed, how so?
Well, a researcher, France, found in 2008 that this deeper learning leads to deeper and more meaningful service. It's not just about ticking off tasks anymore. It's about real commitment.
Okay, so how do you get that deeper commitment? You mentioned adult learning principles earlier.
Right. The foundational idea really is involving the adult learners themselves in all aspects. Planning, implementation, the whole deal.
Sounds like common sense almost.
It does, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Knowles, Holton, Swanson, Lindemann. These names are big in adult education, and they all stress this. Adults need a say in their own learning journey.
But you said earlier, the research backing this up hasn't always been clear.
Well, yeah. It's a bit surprising, but Sorkin-Buske noted back in '86 that there wasn't a ton of scholarly work documenting the specific influence of participation, even though the principle itself was widely accepted.
Huh. Interesting. So the principle's strong, even if the direct proof was maybe lagging a bit back then.
Yeah.
So this 7-step approach we're focusing on, where does it fit in?
It builds directly on a model called the Andragogy and practice model. Andragogy is basically the term for the methods and principles used in adult education.
Okay, andragogy in practice. Break that down for us. What are its core ideas?
Sure. It rests on a few key assumptions about adult learners. First, learners need to know why they should learn something, what's in it for them.
Right, the relevance factor again.
Exactly. Second, self-concept. Adults see themselves as responsible for their own decisions, their own lives. They want to be seen as capable and self-directed.
Okay, makes sense.
Third, prior experience. Adults bring a huge reservoir of life experience, and that's a rich resource for learning for themselves and others.
So you tap into that.
You have to. Fourth, readiness. They're ready to learn things they need to cope effectively with real-life situations. It needs to be timely.
Problem-focused.
That's the fifth point: orientation to learning. Adults are generally motivated to learn to the extent that they perceive it will help them perform tasks or deal with problems they confront in their lives. So learning should be problem-centered rather than content-oriented.
Got it. Less abstract theory, more practical application.
Precisely. And finally, sixth, motivation. While external motivators like promotions can play a role, the most potent motivators for adults are internal. Things like self-esteem, recognition, desire for a better quality of life.
Okay, those 6 points really paint a picture of the adult learner.
They do. And the model is flexible. It acknowledges context matters, individual differences matter. You can approach it sort of from two directions.
How so?
You can either start with the organizational or societal goals you want to achieve and work backwards, designing the learning to meet those goals using andragogical principles. Or you can start with the principles themselves and let them guide the process of setting goals and designing the learning.
Interesting. And the model itself has steps, right? You mentioned 8 elements.
Yeah, the andragogical process involves 8 elements. Think of them as the practical flow.
Okay, run us through those quickly.
Sure. 1, prepare the learner. 2, establish the climate. Make it collaborative, respectful. 3, involve learners in mutual planning. 4, involve them in diagnosing their own learning needs.
Seeing a theme here with mutual and involvement.
Definitely. 5, involve them in formulating the learning objectives. 6, help them design the learning plans or activities. 7, help them conduct the learning experiences. And 8, involve them in evaluating their learning outcomes.
Okay, that's a comprehensive framework. So the 7 steps in the article we're looking at, how do they relate to this?
Think of the 7 steps as a practical, streamlined roadmap derived from that broader Andragogian practice model. The article argues this adapted approach was really what made the Farm Bureau program STV work so well.
STV. Oh, right, strengthening the voice. Okay, let's walk through those 7 steps. Step 1, diagnosing needs through mutual assessment. How did Farm Bureau actually do that?
The key word, again, is mutual. They didn't just decide top-down. They partnered with university researchers.
Okay.
So initial research back in 2004 looked at what the state leaders thought was important for the organization. Things like leadership, understanding the political process, how to run effective boards, and just general knowledge about Farm Bureau itself.
Standard stuff for leaders, maybe.
Pretty standard. But then they surveyed the local members, the volunteers on the ground. And that's where they found a significant gap.
A gap between
How important the local members felt these areas were and how proficient or skilled they actually felt they were in them, especially in leadership skills, the political process, and their Farm Bureau knowledge.
So the needs assessment wasn't just academic. It uncovered a real felt need from the volunteers themselves.
Exactly. And further qualitative research in 2006, like interviews with local board members, confirmed these needs and interests. The same themes popped up again.
So they really triangulated state leaders, local members, qualitative data.
They did. And that mutual assessment involving different levels provided a really solid foundation. Everyone kind of agreed on where the gaps were.
That makes perfect sense. Okay, step 2, setting objectives through mutual negotiation.
Right. So once you know the needs, you need clear goals. But again, mutual. The article stresses that every nonprofit is unique, its values, its mission, what stakeholders expect. You can't just impose objectives.
So how did Farm Bureau handle that? Did they just use the research findings?
They used the research as a starting point, but then they formed a project advisory committee. This committee helped refine the objectives, making sure they aligned with Farm Bureau's overall mission and reality. That's the negotiation part.
Bringing different perspectives together to agree on the goals.
Exactly. And this directly ties back to that goals and purposes for learning dimension in the main Andragogy model.
And this is where the program, STV Strengthening the Voice, really took shape.
Yes. They landed on 5 main topic areas for the program.
What were they?
Effective meetings, always important. Political advocacy and public relations. Member recruitment, development, and involvement, crucial for grassroots groups. Enhancing organizational interactions like internal communication. And finally, Farm Bureau Foundation's understanding the organization itself.
Sounds comprehensive. And they developed curricula for these.
Yep. They collaborated with a university department to create specific half-day workshop curricula for each of those 5 areas.
Okay. Needs assessed, objectives set. Step 3, designing learning plans to fit the context. What did that involve?
Well, first, think about that advisory committee again. It had Farm Bureau staff who knew the organization and the members inside out, and university folks with curriculum design expertise.
A good mix of practical and theoretical knowledge.
Right. And the Farm Bureau staff, crucially, had that deep understanding of the local context, the culture, the members' experiences. There was constant back and forth between the curriculum writers at the university and the advisory committee, especially the Farm Bureau reps.
To make sure it was relevant and practical.
Absolutely. They didn't want something that looked good on paper but didn't land with the actual volunteer.
And how did they decide to deliver the training?
They opted for a train-the-trainer approach.
Ah, so they trained internal people to deliver it.
Exactly. Experienced Farm Bureau field staff were trained to lead the workshops locally.
Why that way? Why not just have the university experts deliver it?
Good question. The thinking was twofold. First, the local board members already knew and trusted these field staff. That existing relationship could make the learning environment more comfortable and effective.
Okay, leverage existing relationships.
Second, the field staff could more easily weave in local examples, making the content even more relevant to that specific group.
Makes sense. And the learning wasn't just the workshop itself, right?
No, they designed it as more of a process. The core was the 4-hour face-to-face workshops. But participants also got manuals to take away, summarizing key points, and they sent out follow-up newsletters later on to reinforce the concepts.
So multiple touch points. Okay, step 4, preparing learners in program promotion. How did they get people ready and excited?
The Farm Bureau staff who were recruiting participants really emphasized that this wasn't going to be a passive lecture. They stressed the active engagement activities, discussions.
Right, setting expectations early.
Right. And the promotional materials, like brochures, highlighted the organization's investment in them, but also, crucially, that the topics came directly from the needs they had identified.
Circling back to that mutual assessment.
Exactly. They even connected the program to best practices, which is language that farmers and landowners are familiar with from their business, making it resonate more.
Smart linkage.
But the article suggests that perhaps the most effective preparation wasn't the brochures, but the informal one-on-one conversations the Farm Bureau staff had.
Really? Just talking to people.
Yeah. Setting those personal expectations, maybe answering initial questions, building that anticipation for something genuinely useful. That personal touch can go a long way in preparing adult learners.
That totally makes sense. Okay, step 5, setting the learning climate at program gatherings. So the workshop starts. What happens?
They deliberately spent the first 10 or 15 minutes really focusing on creating a felt need to learn and building confidence.
How do they do that?
Well, the credibility of the Farm Bureau presenters helped, but they also facilitated a group discussion around the learning objectives, getting participant input right away.
Making it feel shared from the start.
Exactly. And they used a really interesting technique, short video segments.
Videos of what?
Featuring other Farm Bureau members and leaders talking about how they had actually used the concepts being taught and the practical value they got from it.
Social proof. Seeing peers benefit. That's powerful.
Very powerful for adult learners. The presenters also made it clear that success depended on everyone participating, reflecting, asking questions, even answering each other's questions, creating that safe, interactive space.
That psychological safety you mentioned earlier, crucial for getting people to open up and learn.
Absolutely. Okay, step 6, implementing learning activities. So, during the workshop, how did they keep people engaged in learning?
Right, they focused on reinforcing motivation through the activities themselves and the discussion around them.
The article actually mentions Dale's cone of experience.
Cone of experience sounds intriguing.
It's a classic model in education. It basically suggests that people retain more information the more active their learning is. You remember more from doing something than just hearing about it or even seeing it.
So more active participation equals better learning.
Generally, yes. Now, the workshops didn't have tons of time for participants to, say, teach the material to others, which is high on the cone, but the activities provided direct experience, and the discussions allowed for processing and relating it to their own situations.
So experiential activities and talking it through.
Yes. And pacing was important, too, allowing enough time for activities, but also for people to reflect and process, not just rushing through content.
And the learning didn't stop when the workshop ended.
No, like we said, those follow-up mailings helped reinforce key ideas. Plus, the Farm Bureau staff continued to encourage volunteers to try things out in their real roles and informally checked in on how it was going. That real-life application is where the learning really sticks.
Okay, makes total sense. And the final step, number 7, program evaluation and revision. How do they measure success and improve?
They gathered feedback in a few ways. The Farm Bureau Foundation's part of the program seemed particularly well received by everyone. And those immediate end-of-workshop evaluations showed really high satisfaction. Over 98% were satisfied, or very satisfied.
That's fantastic feedback.
It is. And importantly, almost everyone expected to apply what they learned. 59% said, to a great extent. 37% to a moderate extent. There was even a quote from one participant. I've been wanting the needing this info for years.
Wow, that really speaks to hitting a felt need.
Definitely. But they didn't just rely on the happy sheets. 6 months later, they did that follow-up evaluation.
The questionnaire and interviews.
Right, sent questionnaires to participants and a comparison group who hadn't taken it and interviewed the presenters. Satisfaction was still high, but this deeper dive gave them concrete insights for improvement.
Such as?
Specific suggestions for tweaking the content or delivery, maybe areas where the application wasn't as clear-cut. It allowed them to revise the program based on longer-term feedback. It wasn't static.
A continuous improvement loop. Very important. So looking back at this whole STV program and the 7 steps, what were the absolute key success factors?
The article really boils it down to 2 main things. First, long-term planning. This wasn't rushed. It involved years of research and development.
Patience and persistence.
Exactly. And second, perhaps most importantly, that direct and repeated involvement of the participants and stakeholders all the way through.
From needs assessment to evaluation.
Yes. That constant involvement ensured the program was truly on target with their needs, and it built incredible commitment and buy-in.
It sounds incredibly thorough. But was it perfect? Any areas they identified for improvement? And what's the lesson there for us?
That's a great question. One specific thing they noted was the composition of that program advisory committee.
Yes, the one that helps set objectives and review curriculum.
Right. While it had Farm Bureau staff and university reps, it didn't actually include any of the volunteer leaders themselves, the target learner.
Oh, interesting. Why not?
The article mentions concerns about volunteer availability, asking busy people for yet another time commitment.
A common dilemma.
Very common. And they felt the program was still successful without them. However, the authors reflect that including some of those volunteers on the committee could have potentially improved its function.
How so?
By providing immediate gut reactions to ideas, ensuring the learner's perspective was always front and center during the planning. It might have caught potential issues or refined things even earlier.
So the takeaway for you listening.
Yes, this is crucial. Even if it seems difficult logistically, always strive to include the actual learners, your volunteers, in the planning and design process whenever possible. Their voice is invaluable.
That's a really practical piece of advice.
Ah.
So what's the lasting impact? Is Farm Bureau still doing this?
Yeah.
And can others use this model?
Yeah, the article notes that Farm Bureau continues to implement STV, and they've even added new modules over time, so it had legs.
That's great.
And there was an interesting side benefit. The Farm Bureau staff involved in developing and delivering it experienced significant professional growth themselves. Their facilitation skills improved. It shaped their thinking on grassroots leadership development.
A ripple effect within the organization.
Exactly. And other groups apparently showed interest in developing similar programs based on this model.
So it is potentially transferable.
Potentially, yes. The authors are clear. This 7-step process, grounded in sound learning principles, offers a really helpful guide. But they also caution that more research is needed to see how it works in different contexts, different types of volunteer organizations.
Naturally. Every situation is unique.
Right. But they encourage anyone involved in volunteer development to consider applying these steps and, importantly, to share their own adaptations and experiences.
So let's try to wrap up the key message from this deep dive. We've seen a really structured yet flexible 7-step approach to developing volunteer leaders.
Built firmly on adult learning principles, that Andragogy stuff.
And the absolute cornerstones seem to be that mutual assessment, really understanding needs from the volunteer's perspective, and deep ongoing involvement of the volunteers throughout the entire process.
Couldn't have said it better. It's about partnership in learning, not just top-down instruction. It's an investment, not a quick fix.
So for you listening, here's something to chew on. Think about the volunteers you work with, or maybe the volunteer groups you're part of. Where could applying these ideas, really listening to needs involving people in planning their own development, make the biggest difference?
Yeah, what's maybe one small step you could take, based on what we've discussed, to involve your volunteers more directly in shaping how they learn and grow within their roles?
And if this has piqued your interest, definitely look into andragogy and adult learning principles more generally. There's a lot of great work out there.
Absolutely. And just reflect on your own best learning experiences, what made them work. Chances are, some of these very principles were at play. How could you replicate that for others?
Some great food for thought. Well, thanks for taking this deep dive with us into developing volunteer leaders.
Hope you found it useful.